Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's conversation with filmmaker and installation artist Isaac Julien, presented by the Cantor Art Center at Stanford University and Ruby City, San Antonio, Texas. I'm Maggie Dethloff, Assistant Curator of Photography and New Media at the Cantor. Isaac Julien's Western Union Small Boats is featured in the Cantor's current special exhibition, When Home Won't Let You Stay, Migration Through Contemporary Art, which is a show of work by 18 international contemporary artists working in a range of media who are reflecting on the unprecedented amounts of migration around the globe today. The exhibition is organized by Ruth Erickson, Mannion Family Curator, and Eva Reschini, Barbara Lee, Chief Curator, with Annie Pulaguru, Curatorial Assistant at the Institute of Contemporary Art, Boston. The Cantor Art Center's presentation is organized by myself and Jessica Ventura, Curatorial Assistant. We gratefully acknowledge support from the Halperin Exhibition Fund. I'm joined today by my colleague, Michael Heffernan, who's here on tech support. So if you have any issues during the event, please chat Michael. Although the Cantor is not able to open to the public yet, the exhibition is open virtually with a robust website, complete virtual tour, which includes a short clip of Western Union small boats, and related programming held over Zoom, like today's event, which I'm so pleased to be co-hosting with Elyse Gonzales of Ruby City. Elyse, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, I'm Elyse Gonzales, and I'm the director of Ruby City, a new contemporary art center in San Antonio, Texas. We've recently devoted a gallery to a solo presentation of Western Union small boats. Although we are currently closed due to COVID-19, we see this program as a unique opportunity to give our audiences access to The Leopard, a related single-screen film, which is part of our ongoing contemporary film series that we mount in conjunction with Blue Star Contemporary. I want to thank them at this time for their assistance with this program, along with our terrific collaborators at the Cantor. Ruby City was the vision and creation of Linda Pace, a pioneering collector and philanthropist who was also an artist herself. Ruby City's collection of over 1,000 objects reflects her passionate feminist principles, engages social issues, and delves into aspects of spirituality and beauty. Her longtime friendship with Isaac Julien and her deep and long-standing interest in his practice resulted in the acquisition of several of his works. I'm proud and honored to note that Ruby City is the largest repository of Isaac's work. In fact, at almost any time, you will be able to see Isaac's multi-screen video installations on view at Ruby City. Having said that, let's turn to today's program, which allows us to hear directly from Isaac, not only about this incredible work, but his practice in general. For those of you who don't know Isaac Julien, and how could you not? Isaac Julien is a British installation artist and filmmaker. He has developed an internationally renowned reputation for producing works that are conceptually rigorous, formally beautiful, and technically innovative. Furthermore, he is notable for his ability to incorporate and comment on different artistic disciplines, including film, drawing, dance, photography, sculpture, and music. Isaac's reach in terms of subject matter is equally extensive, examining class, sexuality, transcultural identity, Black identity, as well as hidden or lesser known cultural and artistic histories. His work has been shown internationally and is in numerous collections, including the Tate London, the Museum of Modern Art, New York, the Centre Pompidou in Paris, the Hirshhorn Museum and Sculpture Garden in Washington, D.C., and the Zeitz Museum of Contemporary Art in Cape Town, among many, many others. In 2017, he was appointed a Commander of the Order of the British Empire. Currently, he is distinguished faculty at the University of California, Santa Cruz, where he's a co-director of the Isaac Julien Lab. Thank you, Isaac, for being with us, and welcome.
Thank you.
So for today's talk, we wanted to start out with a brief 3-minute video that was recently produced by Shifting Vision, a global platform for art and actuality. It gives us an introduction to the work Western Union Small Boats and our talk today.
You know, sometimes you make some works and then they resonate in another way. I would say like a work like Western Union Small Boat, which was looking at the way that sort of people were moving from one part of the world to the other. In this case, it was across the Mediterranean Sea, from North Africa to Italy. It became a work which got increased exhibition life, you could say, due to some of these things which only accelerated. But I think what I was also trying to do in that work, I was also very interested in Italian cinema. I was interested in the film The Leopard, and to try to go to many locations where Visconti had shot The Leopard and to remime them and to work with dance and choreography and to try to suggest a kind of poetic movement in relationship to these questions. It's really, I think, important to try to explore these questions in a way that are not the kind of normative ways of how these questions are usually reported in the news or something, where basically you become numb around these questions, really. And so how can we give back a kind of subjectivity to those kinds of journeys and those kinds of acts, you know, which of course some people produce a lot of ignited debate. Brexit is one of them. I think we have Brexit in England because on the whole people just got fed up or decided that we need to shut and close down the sort of spaces. And of course it's not very positive in terms of Europe and the effects that it's going to have on Britain. But I mean, we are in these complicated times anyway, and so how do artists kind of try to express the complexity, but perhaps not in the sort of didactic manner which nobody would be interested in anyway. So Western Union Small Boats was a work which was made, as I said, over a decade ago, and basically there's a way in which I think is still very pertinent.
Thank you, Isaac, for pointing out this video and bringing it to our attention so that we could share it today. As we start out with our questions, I wanted to kind of go back to the Leopard and Western Union Small Boats. And so what viewers watched this weekend, The Leopard, is not exactly the same as Western Union Small Boats, the work on view at Ruby City and at the Cantor. The most notable difference is the fact that The Leopard is a single screen work versus a multi-screen presentation, as in Western Union Small Boats. But can you go into a little more detail telling us about the relationship between these two, how they dovetail, how they differ, or what principles or ideas did you apply to create one versus the other?
Well, thank you so much, Elyse, for your question, and also Maggie and everybody at the Cantor Art Centre and Ruby City. I'm so excited about the presentation of Western Union Small Boats, both in the museum exhibition, When Home Would Let You Stay, and also in the solo presentation at Ruby City. So it's a great honor to be able to talk here with you and to discuss the works. And I guess I would say the first thing in relationship to a work like Leopard, which is a single screen version of Western Union Small Boats, a free screen work, which is of course in the title, it has the direct relationship to Visconti's The Leopard. But essentially I would say in relationship between the free screen works and the single screen works, it's really in the single screen works, there's always something more familiar, of course, because in terms of the narrative, the kind of linearity of how the images are edited. Although if you look at the free screen work and the single screen work, the chronology of how it develops, you could say as a story or it's edited, follows the same narrative more or less. and the succession of images, but it's really to do with how we relate and look at that work. So I would say that in the multiple screen work, which is the original version, you have the way in which the images are juxtaposed to one another, and that creates a kind of more poetic rendition or identification, you could say, with the story, and allows the viewer to, in a sense, enter into a different form, I would say, of receiving the images and identifying with them. And I guess in a way you could say in the single screen work, not that I think it's an inferior work, but it's more conventional in the sense that it's the way that we might see images on most occasions. So I would say that in terms of the form, I'm trying to work with this dialectic of images and through the juxtaposition to create a kind of more mobile form of viewing, and to enable also to challenge what I see as the more, if you like, normative ways that we look at images. And I think that's the whole fantastic opportunity that you get in a museum and a gallery context, that you can start to think about the architecture, the placement of the screens in relationship to the audience, that you enter into the piece with this expanded notion of viewing. And so I think this gives the opportunity for a different form of identification, especially when we think about these sorts of stories, which to a certain extent, how they're produced in the dominant media, that we get desensitized to these ways of looking at these questions. And I think that's because of the form and the way in which the information is presented. So, and of course, the choreography or the choreographic aspect is also really important in terms of collaboration with Russell Malafant, being able to think about choreography not only in the form of its rearticulation of these journeys through the kind of more formal expression of dance, contemporary dance, which may seem like an incongruous form to try to articulate or express these journeys, but I was really interested in quoting from the Leopard Visconti's film, where it has a very famous ballroom sequence, and the way contemporizing that in the collaboration with Russell Malafant in the kind of performance that takes place of a different kind in the very same location where Visconti shot Leopard, in Palermo, in Palazzo Gangi, and to try to create this kind of, in a way, a different sort of synergy, of course, in terms of the protagonists. We're no longer in Italy unification, where the aristocratics are becoming taken over by the North, but it's really this moment of Italian identification or disidentification with the South and their neighboring, if you like, continent of Africa, which of course is really, in an odd sort of sense, really part of its history, both architecturally, through food, through music, etc. So, and all of these things are subliminally being reworked in the work, and also not so subliminally. And it's really the idea that one might become sort of reattuned to these questions in a more poetic, but also not just poetic, in a emotionally kind of different manner to ways in which we generally presented those questions. So I'm sorry to go so long-winded in my answer, but yeah.
Not at all. I think what's interesting is that you've put out lots of threads that we're going to be taking up through all the questions to follow. But that was a terrific introduction, in a sense, to this Q&A, because it did bring up so many different issues that we want to talk about. And so I'll turn it over to Maggie, who's going to follow up.
Absolutely, yes. I was going to say much of the same, Isaac. You've introduced so many different topics that we wanted to touch on. And I wanted to start first by asking you about the trilogy that this work, Western Union, Small Unions, is part of, the trilogy that you've done that kind of looks at the movement of people and of migration, which is also a subject you've directly and indirectly addressed in some of your other films. So I wanted to ask, what draws you to migration as a subject for exploration? And I know previously you've referred to a migratory aesthetic. Can you explain what you mean by that as well?
Well, I think in a way we talk about the idea of migration as if it's kind of separate from one, but I think even if we think about where we're all located, if we even think about America today, it's really constructed from a migratory culture. So in a way, I think, the way that the question of migration and globalization and all of these questions which have become so pertinent in our debates became more and more of a subject of contemporary art practice. But at the time when I made Western Union Small Boats, it wasn't so much part of a kind of discourse and practice. But I think for me at that particular moment in 2007, it felt like an important debate that was going to become part of something that would become even bigger. So if you notice in Western Union Small Boats or the Leopard, the boats are actually quite small. They're kind of not large boats. It's only really in the Shifting Vision clip, they actually put images of, migration today, which is actually on a much bigger kind of almost industrial scale. And so these small boats at that particular time were sort of the sightings where people were drowning and dying. And at that particular moment, it just felt really pertinent to me because of the whole history of the Black Atlantic. When I say that, in relationship to the slave trade, to the way in which all of those oceanic representations, they resonate in a particular way in the signifying practices of Black cultures in a diasporic sense. And obviously in my own family history, my parents were from St. Lucia, they came to England, there's that whole narrative aspect, which I think we can connect obviously to debates around migration in the States. But I think also one of the things about this as a kind of aesthetic, which became part of a language for contemporary artists to express in their works, is this sort of countering, if you like, the discourses from the dominant media, that artists wanted to respond their own ways to these questions and to personalize these questions, or to make an attempt to address things which the dominant media couldn't address, really. And I think that's been one of the key factors. And I think out of that, then maybe one could say there was this migratory aesthetic, which I think, for me, resonates in the fact that we have these bricolage approaches in Western Union Small Boats and the Leopard, of dance, of sort of documentary film techniques, performance, they're all kind of juxtaposed in this language. It's like almost like what I'd call a creolized approach to bringing different, what could be seen as incongruous visual methods or ways of making works, or and to bring them all together in one piece, all these different languages. So I see this as this sort of, it's a kind of aesthetics of créalité. And Glisson, Eduardo Glisson, was someone who was very interested in this as a whole philosophical idea. But I think I'm just merely exploring it in its many visual and sonic articulations in the work in terms of the form. And so I think this is something which a lot of artists were involved in. And I think we can see these themes in your exhibition, When Home Won't Let You Stay, which I was trying to explore initially in this early work.
That's fantastic. Thank you for that really robust answer. You mentioned the sound aspect too, the sonic aspect, which is one thing that I love about Western Union small boats, is the way the sound component is sometimes incongruous, to use your word, and sometimes it tricks you into thinking, oh, that's the sound of ship's bells, when really it's not, it's the score. It's really so moving, really literally, because you feel it in your body when you're sitting there watching. But I also wanted to return to the aspects of the installation of the work that you mentioned earlier, and how the installation of the work helps take you away from what we see in the dominant media. So for audience members who haven't seen it in person before, we have a few slides to show you of how Western Union is installed at Ruby City and at the Cantor. It's in a theater painted blue with blue carpet, and the 3 screens are installed at irregular angles to each other. So Isaac, can you tell us why this is and what those particular aesthetic decisions was about?
Well, in Western Union small boats, when we installed it first in Metro Pictures in 2007, where it received its world premiere, we basically were really excited because it was the first time I sort of adopted using hanging screens as opposed to screens which were like on the floor, so to speak. And so it's a translation of, if you like, the sculptural relationship to the image, and then being able to present the 3 screens in a way where you have the possibility for what I'm calling a kind of dialectical montage, which is really just the idea of being able to use the 3 screens to have images at one point where where it's a kind of panoramic kind of view, then it gets broken up into separate screens, or you can use 2 screens against 1 screen and vice versa. And you can also have this kind of sonic remapping of the sound itself in terms of sound design. So all of these things enabled this to come more to this, you was able to bring these things more to fruition, you know, in this. And then the blue, of course, is the oceanic reference. You know, you are in the sea in a metaphoric sense. So, yeah.
Yeah, it's really a wonderfully immersive experience there. When you're in the galleries with it, I hope everyone gets a chance to come and see it sometime. You've also staged this work with live dancers in a production called Cast No Shadows. And Elyse and I were both very interested in your involvement of dancers in the video work and in this restaging with the live dancers. Would you like to tell us a little bit about that decision?
Well, the interesting thing about this work is it was a collaboration between myself and Russell Malafant, in terms of, who is an amazing choreographer, who we basically came together under the auspices of Performer, Rosalie Goldberg's Performer, and Sadler's Wells in London, who were at that time really interested in relationship between performance and contemporary art. And what we were able to do was to have a dual kind of function to the making of the work, that you had this live event for the stage, where basically the footage which we shot was reutilized. But when we were shooting the work, we were always thinking about the fact that the actual film would actually be not just a mere backdrop, but would become synonymous with the performance. So the whole idea was to kind of create the condition for viewing between the performance and the film as a kind of unitary kind of aesthetic. And so in the images that you saw, you can see that there's not really in a way, the performance and the film really become merged into one kind of image, which is really exciting because of course it's live. And so I think that enabled us to also think about the reuse of the sound. Andy Carlton, who is a sound designer, who really dislikes, and but so do I, is to work with sync sound, you know, so as you say, we were able to simulate in a metaphoric way, you know, certain sounds within the score, and that embellished the work. And, you know, so I think in all cases, is to create this haptic relationship to the image, you know, and to really use it as a way of really trying, yet again, another rearticulation of these questions, which we get to be presented in the news, but we seldom get to have that empathetic relationship to. So, yeah, and it was also very interesting to have this choreographic aspect, and which led to lots of debates actually in terms of the piece when it was made.
Wow, thank you. Elyse, I know you have a lot of questions too. Jump in.
So to go back to some of the mention that you made of The Leopard, the film, but also the novel, I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about the settings you chose to shoot within and how those came about, as well as their relationship to the novel and the film, The Leopard. And in particular, I'm wondering about how these sites helped you to flesh out some of the other subjects that you indirectly address, such as global economies, capitalism, and class.
Well, maybe, I mean, one of the things around, if I start around the question of the sites, because that's really important, because we shot in many of the locations where Visconti shot The Leopard. And I think the whole idea around that was to, for example, in the fantastic ballroom sequence in Palazzo Gangi, where we gained access to filming, to have this kind of performance of the choreographic on the floor, which is completely turning upside down this amazing ballroom sequence, which gets completely reworked in the Russell Malafant treatment of it. And at the same time, there was the sort of location of the beach, for example, and all of these different sites which were being remimed. But I think it was in Palazzo Gangi which became really important for me, which is really to do with what is this in dream that people or migrants are thinking about in relationship to the promise of capital, you know. And this question in the new technologies where distances have been, if you like, evaporated, you know, because people can identify and look at things on their mobile phones. The whole question of the desire of the migratory subject, and if you like, in that very famous scene, you have the princess, who is the central figure, one central Palazzo Gangi, and to have the contemporary princess, who is the kind of white woman that, you know, comes to us and sort of, you know, you can see it's her space to a certain extent with the interruption with the Vanessa Mari character. I mean, all of this is really to create a much more sort of, if you like, a creolized space, you know, which is what that actual area of the world is, in fact, you know, and to conjure that. So I think there's those aspects of the different sites, and if you like, the way in which those sites are signified, because this is actually one of the most 10 of the most beautiful locations or spaces in the world in relationship to the kind of Baroque architecture. And I guess my argument really is to say that all of these architectures which are part of the West, like the labor, how they got constituted, came from somewhere. So all the questions around modernity, architecture, even if we think about, you know, the middle of Bloomsbury in London, you know, I mean, now it's become more foregrounded that all of those spaces came about through the ways in which capital was amassed through slavery, and there's always a way in which I think we can connect these amazing spaces with the underside of modernity. So I'm really interested in this underside of modernity, and I think this is one of the things which Russell was trying to point out in the choreography of him dancing, one of the protagonists dancing on the floor, for example. So I think there's this continuous questioning of the questions of locations and sites, signifying on Visconti's leopard, and at the same time thinking about that question of the dreams, you know, where some people have better lives, as it were, in heaven as to opposed in earth, and the fact that people would, yeah, do travel and take great risk for these desires of betterment. So, and I think that's one of the things that you get in Visconti's leopard, that the aristocratic classes know that Italian unification is going to take place. They're going to lose their position of authority. And in a way, it's about that question of how it resonates today, about us living on a global planet, on a space where these questions and journeys will always take place, whether we want them to or not, or whether we like them or not. And what are we going to do about it in terms of really confronting this as a kind of global issue? So I feel I'm talking really on and on. You can't just cut me and say, Isaac, yes, you know, if you want.
This is good. You know, I'm curious, knowing that there is all this hidden history that you're revealing, right, through this film of labor. How were the owners of Palazzo Ganji and the other areas that you filmed, were they completely open to having you present, or did you have to convince them?
Well, it's interesting because the kind of princess of the Palazzo Ganji, actually, when we were sort of doing our kind of site recce, they said, oh, you're never going to actually get access to Palazzo Ganji. No one gets access to Palazzo Ganji. First of all, it's very expensive, and it's only very specially kind of, you know. But when I met Princess Karine, she said that she was familiar with some of my work, you know, that she's, you know, so this was really interesting that she was already familiar with some of my work, and so had a bit of an idea of what it was, what I was doing. And although we had to be incredibly careful because of the value, you know, of the art and the space itself, and so there was a real attention paid to, you know, a sensitivity to the decor. There was actually at one point when we were filming that point of tension of when she's looking, because I wanted her to be in it. And in a way, perhaps that is a point where there's this tension between the story that we're telling and her position, you know, but I think it's a productive one. And I think when she saw the work that she appreciated that. And I think also on the flip side of that, when we were in Lampedusa and we were filming the boats, the disused boats in the courtyard, which in a way, in a metaphoric sense, are like broken bodies, you could say, the broken ships and boats. These were located in part of the island Lampedusa, which was not so easy to find. When we originally did the research, I worked with Hilary Clark, who was a reporter, journalist, who had done some initial reporting a couple of months before we started filming. But when we started to film, they said that the boats were no longer there, that they had been burnt. And we didn't believe that, of course. And so we were able to employ someone to go to that location in Lampedusa when we were filming, and we saw that the boats were still there. And we actually had to go to Lampedusa and, in a way, film illegally to get those images. Although before, under a previous mayor, who was in fact a poet, had given us the permission to film there. So it's really interesting in terms of these different sites as the kind of, you know, antithetical to one another, but the different responses in relationship to making the work.
Exactly. So your film ended up being right in the middle of those politics, and literally because of the filming that was being granted or not granted in terms of locations. It sounds like you really, I mean, so much of your work too is about being that kind of diplomat in these situations and negotiating those channels, which, you know, just adds to the complexity of the work that you end up producing because you're so involved in all of these negotiations. So when you speak about this work, you often mention how it explores the haunting effect of trauma on people, buildings, and monuments. And I think that we all readily see, you know, the reflections of that trauma on people, but can you speak a little bit more about how you see that reflected in relation to the buildings and monuments? I mean, something that you've been alluding to previously, but if you could flesh that out a little bit more.
Well, for example, you could say that the kind of boats that we found in the shipyard, we made a lightbox series out of those images, and the title of it was called something like Sculpture for the New Millennium. Mm-hmm. And so in a way, I was in a way treating the boats as these found objects, you could say, and looking at the sculptural dimension of the broken detritus, or the kind of way in which they were just completely left in these sites. But of course, when we were photographing them, they took on this other life, you know. So I thought of this title about Sculpture for the New Millennium as a kind of ironic title, you know, you could say. I would say that similarly, I would say that sort of several of the kind of sites, for example, where the choreography takes place on the stairs, where we have the dancers rolling and being transported, they were, those kind of movements came out of the interviews that we did with the migrants, African migrants who lived in Palermo, when they spoke about people who had either committed suicide or had been in a position of being treated in not in quite a kind of rough manner. And so this language or experience was translated into the movement of the dancers in relationship to how it was choreographed by Russell Malafant. And so there's a lot of translation. And so in a way, on those steps, there's also this amazing Baroque wave on the banisters, which in a way is a reference, I would say, to the oceanic aspect that, of course, places like Sicily and Lampedusa find themselves in terms of the sea, you know. So you get that sort of articulation in the sort of iconographic aspect of the design. So all of these things to me hinting at that sort of other sort of history within the architecture itself. And in an odd sense, then, if we turn to the spectacular Palazzo Ganji, it's also to do with the relationship to the underside of modernity, the kind of chandeliers, the kind of shimmering kind of aspect. All of it is this very uncanny aspect in relationship to the question of capital and what that represents. Because after all, that's what usually migrants are also desiring. They're desiring to work, but they're also desiring that impossibility sometimes, of the translation of their desire that could lead to something that could be quite, in a way, deathly. So I think when my parents first came to London, the whole idea that the streets were paved with gold, that as literally kind of translation into this very imperial space and how that signifies, it's still that, not romanticism, but, I think all of those things, those imperial dreams and those connections, they're all kind of part of the zeitgeist of why people are on the move.
Which remains the case today, for sure, and certainly what we're all still hearing about in the news today.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I wanted to ask too, Isaac, it's been, 13, 14 years since you first made this work. Do you have additional reflections on it today? Are we having the same kinds of conversations about migration? You've alluded to certain things that are the same, certain things that are different. So how are the conversations differing now?
Well, I think, it's really interesting because, of course, we couldn't quite hear it properly, I think, in that clip, or at least I couldn't in terms of the sound. But I alluded to the idea that Brexit was partly a response to these conversations on migration and the kind of way in which, in England at least, the shutting down of borders through the Brexit debate and a return to a more folkloric aspect of English nationalism, I think, is something which will have ramifications for quite some time to come, as not being a kind of way of responding to these questions in a progressive or in a manner which creates a future, a better future necessarily. But I think also there's the role of technology that's very interesting in terms of how that is utilized in an algorithmic sense, in terms of mapping populations and in terms of the ways in which it could be a form of surveillance. I think that question of surveillance and the way that it maps populations, I think, is key, both in the way in which debates get, if you like, or populations are mapped, but I think it's also key in terms of something that I feel rather suspicious about in terms of the role of new technologies, which are meant to, have this idea of progression in them, but nonetheless, they're utilized for other means of surveillancing and controlling. So I think all of this is really interesting in terms of what I want to call its distancing effect, and to do with that omnipresent eye, which becomes part of a sort of vocabulary for how the other is constructed and framed, which I think is also part of the role that has enabled there to be this increase in migration, because you can't have all of these technological revolutions in terms of iPhones and everybody being able to utilize them and to see things and be connected all around the world, and just think that people will just stay in their place and not have that desiring function, you know, and also it's to do with the space, the codes of where capital accumulation is taking place, you know. So people will basically fight hook or crook to get into those spaces, wherever those populations that are at the center of where capital accumulation are, whether they like it or not. So it's going to be interesting, I think, in the future how we come to terms with that, the role of technology, and how that becomes part of a controlling mechanism in relationship to populations. And then, of course, that goes into the whole aesthetic debate as well, you know, and how can artists use that as a way of both commentary or not, you know, or simply aid these ways of looking and framing these questions in that particular sort of way. So that's where the technologies and the rules of representation still, I think, are things which we need to undermine in the works that we might attempt as critical works in terms of looking at these questions, which I see myself as being very involved in.
Absolutely. And I think speaking of technology and iPhones and everything, so many people in recent years, we've been able to see footage from people on the ground who are not reporters. And so what we're seeing kind of in the dominant media is even changing around what migration looks like. And that combination of how artists are using new technologies, how governments are using new technologies, and how everyone is using new technologies, that seems like a really generative spot to be working in, which is so interesting. And I see that we have our first question in the chat, so perhaps we shall go ahead and take some audience questions, and I'll reintroduce Michael, who's going to help us keep an eye on the chat and ask those questions.
Hey everyone, so feel free to write your questions in. So Isaac, the first question we have is, what was it about the film The Leopard that made you want to build your film around it?
Well, I think, you know, The Leopard is a kind of masterpiece. It's kind of one of my sort of favorite films. I've seen it many, many times, projected as a film. And I think also it's a way of thinking about these questions, not in the kind of what I would say normative or normal way that you would try to pose them. So it's like referencing this kind of, you know, film classic and taking its codes and to a certain extent trying to undo them, you know. So it's taking the kind of way in which you know, the protagonists, and looking at the, you know, which are in the book, you know, the Sicilians, they are the class that feels like it's going to be taken over. But if we look at that from a contemporaneous point of view, that's perhaps what the Sicilians are thinking today in relationship to their close proximity to where they are. And they were the first people in Europe that were really facing that, I think. So, yeah, and so it's really, but also there's the kind of poetics of what gets produced in the poetics of migration. It's not just the idea of problems, you know, there is something else that gets produced in the synergy of these questions, which sometimes are overlooked, I think. Yeah, so.
Awesome. Our next question says, how do you see both The Leopard and Western Union within your oeuvre? Also, has your stay in Brazil back in 2018 had any influence on your take on migration or on your work as a whole?
Well, I mean, of course, the connection to The Leopard and the question of Italian migration connects to the protagonist of my recent work, Lina Babardi, the architect who was Italian, who migrated from Rome to Brazil and became part of really creating a Brazilian modernism in architecture and design. And so you could say, yes, that's an example of where you have a migratory kind of aesthetic that becomes part of the whole lexicon of the language of art, where it's an obvious translation of Italian ideas around modernism, and then it's how it intersects with the both indigenous but also the Afro-Brazilian cultures. So I like the way that Bardi had that conversation with her work. So that's what I tried to bring out in that work. So yeah, there's like a kind of reverse journey, you could say, around this question of migration and what that produces. I guess you could say in works like Western Union Small Boats, I'm really trying to bring together then what is this new language that can be produced from these encounters and looking at this question in the space of video art, and thinking about those as questions that could become part of a lingua franca of contemporary art, which in 2007 it wasn't quite there in the way that it would become now, something that would be sort of familiar. But yeah, so I think, it's just making a connection to these different aspects.
That's great. This next question is a little long, so I'm just going to read it. It says, I'm currently writing about Western Union and 10,000 Waves in a dissertation chapter, and I was fascinated by what you said about dialectical montage and how the installation format of Western Union evokes the 19th century panorama while undoing the singular wholeness of the panoramic field of vision by breaking it up across 3, or in 10,000 Waves, 9 screens. Since panoramas were key to the colonial and imperial practices of geopolitical mapping, I wonder if you think the fragmentary assemblage of your screen installations do the work of remapping or countermapping modernity.
But I think that question, in a way, is a great question, but I think in a way it answers itself, because I obviously do see this is a sort of counter mapping or trying to undo what I'm calling the ontological gaze or the all-knowing gaze, which is very much part of European culture's way of looking anyway, and to break that. So I think that's perhaps one of the main aspects which I'm involved in, which is this cognitive break, that we actually use the screens and their juxtapositions and the relationship between this use of montage, which is really just borrowing Eisensteinian ideas of montage and recapitulating it into a video art practice, which is part of a vocabulary that was part of video art anyway, to some extent, in particular histories or expanded cinema, but to expand those things into the geographic, which became, in a symbolic sense, part of the way in which we started to view the world, since new technologies demanded a repicturing and a rewriting of how we were viewing. But not always in the ways that we like. So, yeah. So I think these works were attempts at creating this this language.
Beautiful. And we have one more. It says, as you were describing your collaboration with Melephant and incorporation of dance into your piece, you mentioned that you were cultivating a haptic relationship to your work, a more visceral understanding of migration, especially in this piece, but also more generally. Do you choreograph the movement of your audience as you're elaborating your work? How do you envision your audience interaction in terms of movement?
Well, yeah, I mean, this is a whole idea around you know, one has different theories around the distracted spectator, because how do we look now? We look partly through our mobile phones, through technologies. We don't have that durational relationship to looking necessarily the same way that we did in a more modernist period. So I think there's ways in which the question of choreographing the spectator through the sound strategies in the work, which have this more sculpture presence. It's also about trying to reawaken how you view and look at images. But to do that, you need to break with convention and to maybe have the possibility for another way of looking. So a lot of this gets signaled by the way in which the sound is orchestrated within the space itself. And so in a way, a work like Western Union Small Boats is key because it's one of the works where I was starting to work with the mobile spectator idea, which is, you know, completely going against the way that we view ordinarily, where we sit down. But of course, it's not new necessarily if we think about VR or the other technologies that are part now of the landscape of how we look. But nonetheless, still, I would argue, return us back to 19th century ideas of looking in terms of how you might view, if we're thinking about VR and those ways of looking, which are trying to break open the way how we view, but I don't know how radical they are because of the way in which the algorithmic aspects command the way of how you look, gaming and so forth. So yeah, I still think there's a radicality in the film installation itself. If you can create this way of looking that gives you this other way of experiencing what you're looking at and hopefully questioning at what you're looking at as well.
Excellent. Thank you so much for answering those questions, Isaac.
Well, thank you. Thank you for the questions from the audience. You know, I think I've spoken far too much. I think, you know, Elyse and Maggie, you know, I'm sure the creators have much more interesting ideas.
I don't think we could have more interesting ideas than you on your own art, Isaac.
You know,
I'm not sure about that.
well, I think this has been really terrific, and I know we're at our hour, but I am curious. I know that this is, you mentioned before in the past that this is the work that is among your most exhibited. It's traveled, it's had its own migration path, as you talk about, all over the world. And, you know, but I'm wondering, like, from your personal point of view, like when you think about the film and that you've made, Western Union Small Boats, what is it about it that you personally feel very either proud or invested in that was maybe that was either new or different or innovative for you from previous works?
Well, in a way, I think it's the collaboration with Russell Malafant and the incorporation of the choreographic body into the work and using that use of choreography as a way of trying to remap these debates and sites.
But
so yeah,
you had worked with choreographers before, though, right?
I had in previous works like Free, Vagabondia. So yeah, I had worked with the choreographic at particular sites, be they in museums or different locations. So, but I think in Western Union Small Boats, there's a way in which the sonic idea of working with sound, and I think the work of Andy Cowton and Adam Finch on the editing, there's a way in which I'm trying to break away from the panoramic to a certain degree, and I think also in terms of the content, it's the incongruous aspect, which some people have commented on as being too beautiful, the lyricism of the work in relationship to the content of the subject matter, so as being inappropriate. All of these aspects, which I think I was in a way utilizing to try to say something else about these questions of migration, which I felt at that particular time in the art world that they felt much more comfortable if these questions were presented in a documentary form. I thought there was some repetition of what was going on in the dominant media, which seeped into the aesthetics of the gallery and art world context in relationship to these questions based on who's making it. So, and there are lots of these questions that I was thinking about in making the work, which are deliberate kind of, if you like, transgressions.
Right.
But yeah, and so I think now seeing the work retrospectively, yeah, I mean, I think there's, you know, to some extent, for example, you know, it wasn't really until nearly 10 years later that I showed that work in England.
Mm-hmm.
When I first made that work, it wasn't shown in England. And I wouldn't say there was a resistance to showing it, but I thought there was a resistance to showing it. So it's almost like people began to show that work more when those questions became more more pertinent, you know. So when it was shown in the Royal Academy, actually won a prize, which and so later on became an RA, a Royal Academician. So it's all very ironic in a way, I think. So I think, yeah. So there's a bit of an ambivalence that I have in relationship to its ongoing sort of exhibition life, but I think at the same time it just shows us the unfinished work. I mean, these are just ongoing, these questions, and they've just got propelled onto a larger sort of area, really. So
become global as opposed to just focused on this one area.
Precisely, yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Isaac. This has been great. I really want to thank you for taking the time to speak with us and for having so many insights that deepened our appreciation for this work. Thank you, Isaac, as well, just for making the work that you do, which is always so revelatory and relevant, and it continues to be. I also want to especially thank the staff at Ruby City, as well as our partners at the Cantor Art Center and the Blue Star Contemporary. And finally, I want to thank all of you for joining us and for tuning in to see The Leopard. Upon reopening, you'll be able to watch Western Union Small Boats at Ruby City through January 2022 and at the Cantor Art Center through May 31st, 2021. Maggie?
Yes, thank you. Pardon me. Thank you, Elyse, for your partnership on this event and for all of your contributions. And thank you so much, Isaac. I've got a lot to think about myself. And I just wanted to add that until the Cantor is able to reopen, you can see our exhibition, When Home Won't Let You Stay, and Western Union Small Boats, a small clip of it on our website as part of the virtual tour. So I hope that you will check it out. The link is in the chat for you. It looks great, even though it's not the full artwork. I do hope you go and enjoy it. And thank you again, Isaac, for joining us, for your wonderful, wonderful comments on your work today. And thank you, everyone watching. Have a great one.
Thank you so much, Elyse and Maggie.
Thank
Michael,
you.
thank you. I'm very grateful. Thank you. Thank you.